Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big stories in the region. My name is Amber Zaman, and this week I'll be talking about the massive earthquakes that struck Turkey and Syria on Monday, February 5th. The devastation is just impossible to capture with words. More than 22,000 people have died so far. As I recorded this podcast, more than 19,000 of those victims were reported in Turkey. The effects of the disaster will be felt for decades. The human toll is already huge. The economic toll is yet to be assessed, but it will be crippling. And what of the impact on Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his ruling Justice and Development Party that's being fiercely criticized over its sluggish response? With us here to discuss these questions is Gonul Tol, Executive Director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program, who just returned from the earthquake zone where she lost loved ones. So welcome to our program, Gonul. We're deeply grateful to you for coming on our show at this very difficult time. We know that you have relatives who've been also affected by this earthquake. So yes, we're very grateful. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Amber.
So you were in that disaster zone, you've just returned from there and you witnessed horrible scenes. Can you give us a sense of what it was like there? What was going on, the rescue effort, the popular mood?
When the earthquake hit early morning on Monday, we were in Mersin, which is only a few hour drive away from Hatay, which is one of the worst hit areas. I was with my sister and her 4-year-old daughter. Obviously, when it first hit, we had no idea where the epicenter of the earthquake was. We were made aware when my sister's husband, who lives in Antakya, Hatay, gave us a call and said that the city had been leveled to the ground, and that his entire family were trapped under the rubble. So then we drove there. So he dug his father out of the rubble with his bare hands. And there was no one, basically. Only 48 hours later, rescue workers showed up, only to tell us that they could not help us because they had been given instructions to focus their rescue efforts somewhere else. So my family was left alone, and our loved one died there, as did many others, thousands of others. And there were no agencies in the first 48 hours. There was no one. There was no civil society. The military hadn't been dispatched. So people were basically left alone. And they did their best to save their loved ones.
I mean, I'm very, very sorry to hear about your loss, but when they said they needed to focus their efforts elsewhere, what did they mean by that? Did you get a sense that people with government connections were somehow being prioritized?
That's exactly right, and that's what we heard. A person, but I cannot tell which party he was from, because the only thing that he said was, I have instructions from a member of parliament from Istanbul that he has relatives in this address, so I need to find out where that is. But aside from that, I think there were instructions. AFAD, Turkey's rescue management presidency, I believe. It was there not early enough, again, but when it got there, I think they had received specific instructions as to what to do, which made things really worse in a way, because not only did they show up late, but they just they operated in a way that didn't make sense to many people who were there, because our family members, when they got there, they were still alive and they could have helped them, and they didn't. So I don't know what guided their operations, but they certainly were not effective, especially to people like me and my family, whose loved ones did not get help on time.
This is absolutely terrible, and we're hearing similar stories from across that region. And Erdogan actually went there, but far from sounding sympathetic, caring, he sounded extremely confrontational, didn't he? And from the get-go, one of the first actions taken by this government was to create this hotline for reporting so-called disinformation. So the government seems to be really very much focused on sort of preserving itself before even giving any thought to how it can, help people, rescue people. Is this curtains for Erdogan and the AKP?
Well, it's early to tell, Birin, because he survived previous disasters. Remember the Soma mining accident that killed 301 miners, and many people thought that would have a huge impact on his election prospects. It didn't, and there were others. There was the Chorlu train accident. Again, I believe 25 people lost their lives there. And if you look at, so there's a pattern here, and Erdogan makes us to believe that we should accept it as fate, but there is actually a bigger story to tell here. Corruption and misrule have played a huge role in paving the way to an even bigger tragedy. Now, I understand an earthquake of this magnitude, it kills people. But these earthquakes kill more people. They are more lethal in countries where institutions do not work, independent, capable institutions are not there, where a handful of cronies in construction companies have been granted government infrastructure, government contracts, and they have very little disregard for safety regulations, for building codes, where civil society organizations have been wiped out. When the 1999 earthquake hit northwestern Turkey, I was a college student, and we were pretty quick in mobilizing a network of university students to go there to help the victims. And when we got there, Turkish military had been dispatched. There were other civil society organizations, and there were rescue workers. It was a devastating incident, and yet you could see that there were several government agencies and civil society organizations on the ground trying to help people. Not this time.
And that's very interesting because, I covered that earthquake, and of course, people were bitterly complaining about how slow and bungled the government response was. And indeed, we all believe that played a role in the rise of the AK Party, and the fact that the parties who were in power at that time, just all collapsed in that election that did bring the AK Party to power. So to hear you say that it's even worse this time, how can Erdogan, despite, all the skills and all the luck he's had, and how he's managed to persuade people, at least some people, that this is their fate and, it's Allah's will, etc., that he can pull this off again this time when it's on such a massive scale and we are in the midst of a huge economic crisis? Don't you think this is kind of a turning point, and that at the same time the wall of fear has also crumbled in Turkey?
It is a turning point. I think in many ways, you're right. I mean, the level of destruction is so huge that it's almost impossible to think that this will not have any impact on his electoral prospects. But on the other hand, I'm sorry to say this, well, we have to be paying attention if you want me to address this question about how this would impact the election prospects. We have to be paying attention to when and how the elections will be held. Remember, the earthquake affected an area where there are almost 10 million people live there, right? So how are you going to hold elections in these regions? And who did they vote for in the previous election? So you have to take those things into consideration. And the second thing is, I think it's already had an implication, effect on the opposition. Erdogan has been blessed with a divided opposition, and just a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about how the opposition failed to field a candidate, that they were still so divided that they would not be able to pull this off. No one is talking about that right now. And the opposition, I think the main opposition party's leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, did the best thing, where he put the blame on Erdogan, saying, this is on you, Erdogan. The reason why there's so much destruction, it's because of you, because you've centralized power in your own hands. And the other important party, E-Party leader, said the same thing. So I think it will have implications on many levels. But again, having seen Erdogan, having survived similar incidents, I'm just saying that we should just still wait, because he can still take steps to heal the wounds, and that could improve his prospects. But I think it's going to be extremely difficult. He really has to do his very best. And I haven't seen that so far.
Exactly. And as we said, he's been quite confrontational. But at the same time, of course, he has become, I think, much more vulnerable on many fronts, and on the diplomatic front too. Do you see all of this sort of having an impact on his very confrontational foreign policy? I mean, will Erdogan still be able to say to NATO, for example, no, you can't take Sweden in unless Sweden does X, Y, and Z? Can he still talk about invading northeast Syria?
It's extremely difficult, Amberin. And remember what the Minister of Interior has said about the US. He's been attacking 24/7 the US and the Western world, and yet they were really quick to ask for help from the Western world right after the earthquake hit. And I just today I saw a NATO decision, I think, and they also dispatched, the US also dispatched a military ship that's going to be very critical to help the victims there. So allies have mobilized, and it's going to be very difficult for him to do the things, to say the things that he's been saying until now. And regarding another military incursion into Syria, that would be I think a suicide. Not right now. He cannot possibly legitimize that. Before, it was difficult for him to legitimize that from an international point of view, but he didn't care, as long as people at home bought his argument that this was the best course of action to address the refugee question. He cannot do that right now. He cannot sell that idea to a country that's been hurting, So it's going to be very difficult. He's going to have to scale back what he's been doing on the foreign policy front.
In the meantime, something interesting happened. We all know, of course, that several Kurdish dominant regions were badly affected, and you're already hearing, people saying that they were discriminated against because they were Kurdish, because they were Alevi, that help's not arriving. It's hard to substantiate. It seems that, just judging by your own personal story, that a lot of people, are being treated like second-class citizens. But the PKK came out and said that it was declaring a unilateral ceasefire inside Turkey, that it would not attack any Turkish military targets unless it came under attack itself. How do you, what do you think of that statement? Why now, and what's the calculation?
Well, even terrorist organizations need to be seen as legitimate actors, and I think this was certainly the right decision. For many years, the PKK always argued that we never target civilians, we only target military targets. Now we know that that's not true. They've targeted civilians, but when they say that, that's their effort to legitimize their cause, because they still have to appeal to an important segment of the country. They still have a constituency, and in their eyes, the PKK is still a legitimate organization. it's not a killing machine. That's how they see it. So they have to be able, that's why even terrorist organizations, they have to have concerns about these humanitarian situations. So it was the right call on their part. But I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if they're going to come under attack and then they will attack back. But this is certainly an effort on their part to be seen as a legitimate actor, not only for the people in Turkey, but also be seen as such to a larger international audience. Because remember, the PKK and the PYD, because of what's been happening in Syria and their fight against ISIS, they have a different profile now in the Western world. So they want to keep that, I think, intact, and that's how I see their latest decision.
That's very interesting. You just wrote an excellent book called Erdogan's War, A Strong Man's Struggle at Home and in Syria. Now, of course, there's a whole Syrian dimension to all of this because Syria was also affected. And at the same time, we have this effort at normalization by Erdogan with Bashar al-Assad, with Assad saying, sure, but you have to get out of Syria first. My first question to you would be, do you see this normalization process being in fact accelerated by what's just happened? Because after all, one of the big fears lurking in Erdogan's mind must be that all those people in northwest Syria who were, affected by this earthquake may well want to come to Turkey, and perhaps, cooperating with the regime in some way helps prevent that. What are your thoughts on that, Gunul?
Good question, Amberin. I think, but right now, I think he's going to be too much focused on what's happening in the country. And I'm expecting him to postpone elections. I think it's going to be very difficult for him to hold elections in May. He could postpone a month or two. A lot of people are saying that it's really not easy for him to postpone that for a year. And some people have raised that point. So that means he has a very small window of opportunity to do something meaningful for his domestic goals on the foreign policy front. So before the earthquake, normalization with Assad was certainly high on his agenda. For basically domestic reasons. Again, he frames any incursion into Syria, along with shaking hands with Assad, as the only way to address the refugee question, which is a high priority for Turkish voters. So that was, I had been expecting that to happen before the elections, but now with what's happened on Monday, that's going to be very difficult. I mean, doing anything major on the foreign policy front is going to be difficult because all energy and efforts they have to be focused on the domestic front and healing the wounds of this tragedy.
For sure. One final question, Gönül. How would you assess the opposition's performance, and in particular Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who rushed to the disaster zone? He got there before the president did.
I was pleasantly surprised, and I particularly appreciated his statement that put the blame on Erdogan. Because, as you said, Erdogan always frames these things as an act of God, accept it as a faith, and just move on. But that's not it, is it? It's not just fate. It's his policies, his corruption and misrule that's caused so many deaths, and someone has to pay for this. So that's why I appreciated Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's initial statement. I wasn't sure whether Meral Akşener, the leader of E-Party, was going to join him. But she did a day after, basically saying so many people have died because you centralize power in your own hands, and there is no one who is willing to take any initiative to respond to a crisis like this. You really need independent and capable institutions and independent people in key positions who are willing to take an initiative, right? You can't just wait for Erdogan's call from Ankara when there are thousands of people are buried under the rubble. And that's exactly what people did. Because no one can lift a finger before getting a green light from Erdogan. There's just one man who makes all the decisions in the country, and everyone has to wait for the word that will come out of his mouth. But that's not how you can operate in a situation like that. You have to act fast. You have to take an initiative, sometimes take a risk. You have to be capable, and none of that was there. So I think Kılıçdaroğlu and Meral Akşener's statements were great, and I also appreciated the CHP run municipalities' efforts to send people to the affected regions, and so far they've been very effective in delivering aid and taking part in search and rescue efforts.
There was a lot of criticism over the fact that the army wasn't deployed in the early days, and even when it was in such few numbers. Is it that Erdogan is scared of giving the army a role? Is he still frightened that, somehow this will empower the military in ways that could threaten him?
That's my theory. That's my first thought, because I thought, and let me say this, Erdogan's MO, when something like this happens, he disappears. He doesn't respond for a few days. He lets his aides and ministers talk to address the people. So if something fails, it's on them. And then he appears in front of the cameras. This time, it took him 3 days, but still, by his own standards, that was early. So that means how terrified he is of the prospects in the upcoming elections. So I think he he probably thought twice before dispatching the military, thinking that at a time when anger is directed at him and his government, he probably did not want the military to be the heroes, he didn't want to see this united front between the people and the military at a time when he's getting blamed. And of course, that's just my theory.
I could carry on this conversation forever. It's always a fascinating discussion with you, dear Gonul, but you have so many demands on your time, so I'll let you go. Thank you again for coming on the show at this horribly difficult time.
Thanks, Amberin.
This brings us to the end of another episode of On the Middle East. Our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Turkey and Syria. Thank you and goodbye.